Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from. In the comments below, it is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. She arrived on the last train of the evening, not because she had planned it that way, simply because the connections from London had been what they were. The main line delayed, the branch line waited for, the final stretch from the village station covered in a trap driven by a man who said very little and seemed to consider this a virtue. The Devon night pressing in on both sides of the lane, the hedgerows very close, the horse moving with the unhurried patience of an animal that knew exactly where it was going and had no opinion about the hour. Nell Marsh sat in the back of the trap with her trunk and her work bag and looked at the darkness. She was 36 years old. She had been cooking in London since she was 14, first as a kitchen maid, then as undercook, then as cook in 2 successive households, neither of which had been particularly large or particularly distinguished, but both of which had given her what she needed: the knowledge, the speed, the particular confidence of someone who has stood at a range in every condition a range could produce and has not been defeated by any of them. She had come to Aldwick Hall because it was not London. This was the whole of the reason, not the position, which was good head cook, full kitchen staff, a household that ran properly and expected to be fed properly, not the wages, which were better than her last. Simply that it was not London, that it was Devon, that it was a lane in the dark with hedgerows on both sides and a horse that knew where it was going, and a silence that was the real kind, not the silence between city sounds, but the silence of a place that had always been quiet and saw no reason to change. The trap turned through a gate and the house appeared. Aldwick Hall was large. She had known this from the correspondence, the household accounts, the staff list, the menus the previous cook had left as guidance. Large enough to require a kitchen maid, a scullery maid, a still room maid, and occasional extra help for entertaining. Large enough to have its own kitchen garden, its own dairy, its own gamekeeper who supplied the house with whatever the season offered. Large enough that the east wing had been closed for 3 years and was not expected to be opened again. But knowing a house was large and arriving at it in the dark on a November evening were different things. She looked at the facade as the trap came up the drive. Warm grey stone, the Devon kind, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflecting it and held it until the light was gone entirely and then simply became part of the dark. Many windows, most of them unlit at this hour, the upper floors dark, the family wing dark, the east wing very dark. But at the far left of the ground floor, the familiar amber glow of a kitchen that had been burning since this morning and would burn until tomorrow morning, the kitchen that was now hers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, met her at the servants' entrance. A woman of perhaps 60, small and very upright, the posture of someone who had spent 40 years reminding herself and others to stand properly. Clear, sharp eyes, An expression that was not unfriendly but was not yet warm, the expression of someone withholding judgment with professional courtesy until judgment could be properly formed. She said, "You are later than expected." Nell said, "The main line was delayed. I am sorry for it." Mrs. Poole looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "The kitchen staff have gone to bed. I have left something for your supper. I will show you the kitchen tonight and the rest of the house tomorrow." She led Nell through the servants' corridor and into the kitchen. The kitchen was the largest room Nell had ever worked in. She stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked. The ceiling higher than any kitchen ceiling she had known. The range along the far wall, enormous 6 burners, 2 ovens, a warming shelf above, the fireplace beside it, the real fireplace, the original one that predated the range by a century, its lintel black with 100 years of smoke. A fire burning in it tonight, not a cooking fire, a warming fire. The kind you kept going through the night in a large cold house, because the alternative was a kitchen that never fully warmed. Copper pots on the wall, dozens of them, every size, every shape, hung with the deliberate order of someone who had placed each one where it would be most useful and expected it to stay there. They caught the firelight and gave it back the whole wall alive with the particular amber warmth of copper in a firelit room. A long wooden table down the center of the room, scrubbed pale, a dresser against one wall with the everyday crockery, shelves of dry goods, flour, sugar, salt, the things a kitchen always needed in sufficient quantity. Herbs drying from a beam, rosemary, thyme, the lavender that had no culinary use but that someone had hung anyway, perhaps for the smell. And on the hearthrug in front of the warming fire, a cat, grey and white, deeply asleep, arranged with the particular completeness of a cat that has found exactly the right spot and has no intention of reconsidering. Mrs. Poole said, "That is Thomas. He came with the house. Your supper is on the table." She left. Nell stood in the kitchen alone with Thomas and the fire and the copper pots and the smell of the room old stone and wood smoke and the residual warmth of a day's cooking, the particular smell of a kitchen that had been a kitchen for a very long time. She sat at the table. She ate her supper, cold beef, bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a cup of tea from a pot, still warm on the range. She ate without hurrying, looking around the kitchen as she ate, learning it the way she always learned a new kitchen, slowly, with full attention, beginning with the general and moving toward the particular. The particular took time. She was still learning when she noticed the drawer. It was in the dresser, not the drawers she had already opened, the ones containing the expected things. Utensils, string, spare candles, the accumulated practical contents of a kitchen drawer. This was a smaller drawer, set slightly to one side, easy to miss unless you were looking carefully, which she had been. She pulled it open. Inside, a single object, a notebook, small, cloth-bound, the cloth a deep green that had faded to something between green and grey, the spine slightly worn, the edges of the pages soft with use, a notebook that had been consulted many times and was now here in the small drawer, set aside, left. She lifted it out. She turned it over in her hands. No name on the cover, no label, simply the notebook itself, worn and slightly warm from the kitchen air. She opened it. The first page, not a recipe, not a shopping list, a single line, written in a small, neat hand, the ink slightly faded. For the kitchen, and whoever tends it. Nell read the line twice. She turned the page. The second page was a recipe, but not only a recipe. Above the ingredients and the method, a heading in the same small, neat hand. For Mrs. Poole, when the cold gets into her hands in January. A soup, simple onion, barley, the stock of a roast chicken, a small amount of cream at the end. Warming without being heavy, the kind of thing you made for someone who needed warmth from the inside rather than the outside. Now looked at the heading again. For Mrs. Poole, when the cold gets into her hands in January. She had met Mrs. Poole 40 minutes ago, a woman of 60, upright, precise, withholding judgment. She had not yet seen her hands. She had not yet seen January. She turned the page. The third page, for James, when the horses are difficult and he will not say why. A bread recipe, dense and dark rye flour, treacle, the kind of bread that took time and produced something that lasted. The kind of bread you ate with something substantial and felt it for hours afterward. She did not yet know who James was. The coachman, perhaps, or the groom, or someone else entirely. She had not yet met the outdoor staff. She turned the page again. The fourth page. For the young footman, Thomas not the cat when he has had a letter from home and cannot eat at dinner. A custard, warm and very simple. The kind a child would recognize. The kind that required no decision. You simply ate it because it was there and it was warm and it asked nothing of you. Nell set the notebook on the table beside her half-eaten supper. She looked at it, at the cloth cover, faded green, at the pages she had already turned, each one with its heading and its recipe, each one written for a specific person in a specific moment that the writer had anticipated, had known, somehow would come. She thought, who wrote this? She thought about the previous cook, the one whose menus she had been given as guidance, whose kitchen this had been. She had never learnt her name. The correspondence had referred to her only as the former cook, which was the way of these things. People came and went from positions, and the positions went on regardless. She thought she knew them. Whoever wrote this knew this household, knew Mrs. Poole's hands in January, knew James and his difficult horses, knew the young footman and his letters from home. She picked up the notebook again. She turned to where she had stopped. She kept reading. She read until the fire needed tending. Then she tended it and read more. The pages turning slowly in the warm kitchen, Thomas still asleep on the hearthrug, the copper pots still glowing on the wall, the house very quiet above and around her. The November night pressing at the kitchen window, a small, high window, and through it a rectangle of darkness, and in the darkness, just visible, the first suggestion of frost on the glass. Page after page, each one a person, each one a moment, each one a recipe chosen with the care of someone who understood that food was not simply fuel but language, that you could say things with a soup that you could not say with words, that a custard left quietly on a table was a form of I see you, that bread made with treacle and rye and thyme was a form of it will be all right. The writer had understood this completely, had spent, Nell thought, many years understanding it, had watched the household with the particular attention of someone whose job put them at the center of everyone's needs, and who had used that position to learn, quietly and without calling attention to it, what those needs actually were. She was 20 pages into the notebook when she looked at the clock. 1:30. She closed the notebook. She set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the faded green cloth, the soft page edges. She thought, "Tomorrow I will read the rest." She thought, "Tomorrow I will meet the people." She banked the fire for the night. She rinsed her cup. She did the small things a cook did at the end of a kitchen day, not because anyone required it at 1:30 in the morning on her first night, but because the kitchen deserved it. Because leaving a kitchen properly was a form of respect for what it was and what it did. At the door, she paused. She looked back at the kitchen, the banked fire, the copper pots, the table with the notebook on it. Thomas still on the hearthrug, profoundly asleep, one paw over his nose. She thought, "This is a good kitchen." She thought this simply, without qualification, the way you thought things that were simply true. She went upstairs to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. It sounds old stone, old timber, the particular language of a large house at night. The wind in the elm trees outside her window, the distant sound of something small moving in the wainscoting, the deep, thorough quiet of Devon pressing in from all sides. She thought about the notebook, about each page, about the person who had written it and had left it in the small drawer and had written on the first page, "For the kitchen and whoever tends it." She thought, "It was left for me." Not for her specifically, she had not been hired when it was written, perhaps had not been known at all, but for whoever came next, for whoever opened the small drawer, for whoever stood at this range and tended this fire and cooked for these people who each had their moment and their need and their particular form of difficulty that food could speak to when words could not. She closed her eyes. The house settled around her. The kitchen below warm and banked and patient. The notebook on the table, waiting to be read, as it had always been waiting, for whoever would come and tend the kitchen and learn to speak its language. She was in the kitchen at 5, not because anyone had told her to be. She had simply woken at 4:30 in the unfamiliar room with the unfamiliar sounds of the house around her, and had lain for a while in the dark, and then had risen, because lying in the dark in an unfamiliar room had never suited her, and the kitchen was downstairs, and the kitchen was where she needed to be. The kitchen was cold at this hour. Not bitterly, the banked fire had held through the night, the range still warm to the touch, but cold in the way of a large stone room that has rested and is not yet fully itself again. She built the fire up methodically, laid the range, put the kettle on, the ordinary sequence of a cook beginning a kitchen day, which she had performed so many times in so many kitchens that her hands did it without instruction while her mind was elsewhere. Thomas appeared from somewhere as the fire caught. He materialized in the way cats materialized, without audible arrival, simply present where he had not been a moment before. He sat beside the range and looked at her with the assessing expression of a cat deciding whether someone was worth his attention. She ignored him. He appeared to find this satisfactory and settled into a loaf beside the warmth. She made her tea. She sat at the table with it and picked up the notebook. She had stopped at page 20 the night before. She found her place and continued, the pages coming one after another in the early morning quiet of the kitchen, each one a person, each one a moment, each one a recipe, chosen with the same care she had noticed the night before. For Mr. Carew, the butler, when the family has been difficult and he has managed it without complaint, which he always does. A potted game, something that took time to prepare and required good ingredients, the kind of thing that said without saying it that the effort had been noticed. even if no one else had noticed it. For Lily, when she has been crying in the scullery and will not say why. A small cake, lavender and honey, the kind that smelled of something calmer than the present moment. For the gamekeeper, whose name she had not yet written down because she always forgot and would correct this. A pie. When the winter has been long, he will know. Nell paused at this one. She will know. As though the notebook understood it might outlast the writer's own tenure. As though it had been written with an awareness of the person who would come after. She kept reading. For the family's youngest daughter, who is 7 and afraid of thunderstorms. Warm milk with honey and a pinch of nutmeg. Bring it to her room yourself. Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face. Nell read this and was still for a moment. Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face. The recipe almost beside the point, the instruction, the thing. The understanding that a frightened child did not need warm milk, needed the warm milk to be a reason for the presence of another person. She thought, whoever wrote this understood people, not in the abstract way of someone who had thought carefully about human nature, in the specific way of someone who had been watching specific people in a specific house for a long time and had noticed what they needed and had found the kitchen was the place where those needs could be quietly, consistently, without ceremony, met. She turned the pages slowly now, reading each one with the full attention it deserved. The kitchen maid arrived at 6. A girl of perhaps 16, Nell, had not yet learned her name. She came in through the scullery door with the slightly defensive manner of someone expecting to be found at fault before she had done anything fault-worthy. She stopped when she saw Nell at the table with the notebook. Nell looked at her. She said, "Good morning. You are?" The girl said, "Lily, ma'am." Nell looked at the notebook, at the page she had read 20 minutes ago. For Lily, when she has been crying in the scullery and will not say why. She said, "Good morning, Lily. The fire is up. I need the bread started by past. The girl nodded and went to the bread table and began. She worked without speaking, the careful silence of a young person in a new situation, not yet certain of the rules. Nell watched her hands for a moment. Competent enough. She would learn the rest. She put the notebook in the pocket of her apron. She rose and went to the range and began the work of the morning. By 7, the kitchen was fully itself. The scullery maid had arrived and been set to work. The kitchen maid was doing the bread. Nell was at the range, moving through the morning's requirements with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and understood that the first hour set the tone for everything that followed. Mrs. Poole came at 7:30. She came every morning at this hour. Nell would learn the inspection of the kitchen not as a demonstration of authority, but as a genuine interest in how the day was beginning. She had the manner of someone who had been running large households long enough to know that the kitchen was the organ the whole body depended on. She said, "You were up early." Nell said, "I always am." Mrs. Poole looked around the kitchen, the bread on the table, the range going properly, the scullery maid already at the sink. Her expression shifted slightly. Not warmth yet, something approaching the beginning of it. She said, "The family dines at 7. Mrs. Aldwick prefers plain food, well made. She does not like surprises at the table." Nell said, "I understand." Mrs. Poole nodded and left. Nell watched her go, the upright figure, the careful walk. She thought about the page in the notebook. When the cold gets into her hands in January, she looked at Mrs. Poole's hands as she left the kitchen. The door held, the hands around the handle. Not yet November. Too early to see what January would bring. She went back to the range. The morning passed, as mornings in a large kitchen always passed. With the particular momentum of many things happening in the right order, the order determined not by any single decision, but by the accumulated logic of many years of this being the work and this being how it was done. Nell moved through it with the ease of someone for whom the work had long since stopped being thought and become reflex. Her hands knew what to do. Her mind was elsewhere in the notebook, in the people she had read about and was now beginning to encounter. James came to the kitchen door at 10 for his mid-morning tea. A man of perhaps 45, outdoor complexion, the particular quietness of someone who spent most of his time with animals and had adopted their economy of movement. He said good morning and collected his tea and said thank you and left. Nothing about horses, nothing about difficulty, but she had read his page and she watched him go with the particular attention of someone who now knew something they had not known before. The young footman came through at noon. Thomas, not the cat. Perhaps 19, the kind of careful about everything manner of a young man in his first proper position. He stopped to say that luncheon had been well received by Mrs. Aldwick. He said it with the slight excess of formality that suggested he was nervous about saying it and had decided it needed to be said. Nell thanked him. She watched him go. She thought about custard, about letters from home. She took the notebook from her apron pocket during the quiet after luncheon. She sat at the table and read while the kitchen maid washed up and Thomas the cat slept on the hearthrug and the fire did its steady work. The pages continued. For Cook herself, the instruction addressed directly to whoever was reading. When you have been on your feet since 5, and it is past 2 in the afternoon, and the dinner still to do, make this for yourself. Eat it standing at the range if you must, but eat it. A recipe for a simple egg dish, quick, substantial, requiring nothing but what any kitchen always had. With a single further note below, you are allowed to sit down. The kitchen will wait. Nell read this twice. She looked at the clock, 2:15. She had been on her feet since 5. She did not make the egg dish. There was the dinner to do, and the afternoon was already advancing. But she sat down for 10 minutes, simply sat, with her tea and the notebook and the fire and Thomas. 10 minutes in which she did nothing that could be called productive, and felt, at the end of them, entirely restored. She thought. She knew this too. She thought. How to take care of the person taking care of everyone else. In the afternoon, she walked the kitchen garden with the gardener, a man of perhaps 60, unhurried. The knowledge of the garden very settled in him, the knowledge of someone who had been here long enough to understand not just what grew but why, not just what was available but what was possible. He showed her the beds, the winter vegetables, the herbs still holding, the root cellar with its stores. He pointed out what would come in December, what in January, what she would need to order from the village, and what the garden could supply. She listened carefully. This was part of the work she loved, the learning of a new kitchen's possibilities. Every kitchen was different. Every kitchen had its particular relationship with what surrounded it, its own economy of what was available and what was not, and what could be done with each. Walking back through the kitchen garden in the November afternoon, she thought about the notebook, about how much knowledge it contained, not just of the people of the kitchen, of the seasons, of what the hall required and when and in what form. the accumulated knowledge of a cook who had been here she did not yet know how long. Long enough to know Mrs. Poole's hands in January. Long enough to know James and his horses. Long enough to know a frightened child needed a face, not a maid. She thought, I should ask how long she was here. She thought, I should ask her name. She asked Mrs. Poole that evening. After dinner was done, and the kitchen was settling into its evening quiet, and the family had gone to the drawing room, and the staff had dispersed, and it was just Nell and Mrs. Poole at the kitchen table with the last of the day between them. She said, the previous cook, how long was she here? Mrs. Poole said, 31 years. Nell said, and her name? Mrs. Poole said, Martha Webb. She said it simply, the way you said the name of someone you had worked alongside for 31 years and who was gone now and whose absence was a presence in every room she had occupied. Nell said, I found her notebook in the small drawer in the dresser. Mrs. Poole was quiet for a moment. Her expression shifted, something moved across it, something that contained more than could be said at a kitchen table on a first evening. She said, I wondered if you would. Nell said, did you know what was in it? Mrs. Poole said, some of it. She told me, near the end, that she had written things down. She said, she paused. She said the kitchen needed to know the people, and the people needed the kitchen to know them, and she did not want that knowledge lost when she went. Nell looked at the notebook on the table. She thought about 31 years of watching, of noticing, of understanding what each person needed and what the kitchen could do about it, of writing it down so that the next cook, whoever that turned out to be, would not have to start from nothing, would have, from the very first drawer she opened, a guide. She said, she was very good at her work. Mrs. Poole said, yes, she was. They sat for a while with the fire and the lamp and the quiet evening kitchen around them. Thomas on the hearthrug, the copper pots on the wall, the notebook on the table. Then Mrs. Poole rose and said good night and went, and Nell sat alone with the kitchen for a while longer, the fire doing its work, the house very still above, the November dark at the small high window. She picked up the notebook. She turned to where she had left off that afternoon. She read. November settled into the hall with the particular patience of a Devon November. Not dramatically, no single morning when everything changed. More the way the month always moved in this part of the world, which was through accumulation. One morning the mist stayed until noon. Another, the kitchen garden was white, with the first hard frost. Another, the elm trees beyond the stable yard had given up their last leaves and stood bare and decided against the pale sky. Nell moved through it. She had been at Aldwick Hall for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks was not long enough to know a kitchen fully, not long enough to understand all its rhythms and requirements and the particular way its days arranged themselves, but long enough to begin, long enough to have the range's particular temperament in her hands, long enough to know when Thomas wanted feeding and when he simply wanted to be acknowledged and when he wanted to be left entirely alone. Long enough to have read the notebook through twice. She kept it in the small drawer, now returned it after each reading, the way you return something to its place because that was where it belonged. But she knew its contents without opening it, had carried the pages in her mind the way she carried recipes she had made many times, not as a list to be consulted, but as a settled knowledge available when needed. She was waiting, quietly, for the moments the notebook had described, not impatiently. The way you waited for something you trusted would come with the particular ease of someone who knew what they were waiting for and was content to let it arrive in its own time. The first moment came on a Tuesday. She heard it before she saw it, a sound from the scullery that was not the sound of work, a brief, very controlled sound, the sound of someone who has decided they are not going to cry and is not entirely succeeding. She set down what she was doing. She went to the scullery door. Lily was at the sink with her back to the door, her shoulders very still, her hands in the water. The particular stillness of someone who knows they have been heard and is hoping not to be seen. Nell did not ask what was wrong. She went back to the kitchen. She went to the pantry and found the lavender dried from the beam, the good Devon lavender that had been hanging since summer. She found the honey. She began the cake. It took 40 minutes. Small, golden, the lavender just present, not perfumed, simply suggested, the honey giving the crust a warmth that plain sugar did not. When it came from the oven, she set it on the table and cut a slice and put the slice on a small plate and set the plate at Lily's place at the kitchen table. She said nothing. Lily came in from the scullery 20 minutes later, her face composed and her eyes slightly red and her hands dry. She saw the plate. She sat down. She ate the cake in small, deliberate bites and then sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She said, "Thank you, ma'am." Nell said, "The copper saucepans need polishing this afternoon if you can manage it." Lily nodded and rose and went to the copper saucepans. Not fixed, whatever had happened was still there and would need its own resolution, but steadied, set back on her feet enough to continue the afternoon, which was what the cake was for. Nell went back to the range. She thought about Martha Webb, about 31 years of exactly this, of noticing and not asking, and simply providing what was needed without requiring any acknowledgement of the need. The particular dignity of that, the particular skill. She thought, I am learning her language. James came to the kitchen door on a Thursday morning with a different quality about him. She noticed it immediately, the set of his shoulders, the way he took his tea, without his usual brief exchange about the weather or the horses. He drank standing at the door as always. He said thank you as always. But the ease was not there. Something had been difficult and had not resolved and was still present, carried carefully, not mentioned. She did not ask about the horses. She began the bread that afternoon, the dark rye, the treacle, the long first rise, the recipe from the notebook. She had bought the rye flour specifically because a kitchen without it was a kitchen not fully prepared. She made 2 loaves, one for the kitchen, one for the stables. She wrapped the second one in a cloth and sent it with the kitchen maid at 4 o'clock with no message. Simply the bread. She heard later from the scullery maid, who heard things in the way scullery maids always heard things, that one of the horses had been ill and James had been up with it 2 nights running. That the horse had been uncertain. That this morning the horse had eaten and James had eaten too for the first time in 2 days. Nell stood at the range and thought about the bread arriving in the stables at 4 o'clock, about James unwrapping it, about eating something substantial and dark and made with time and feeling, perhaps without knowing quite why, that someone had noticed. She thought, that is what the bread does. She thought, it says I see you without requiring you to be seen. The youngest daughter came to the kitchen for the first time on a Friday afternoon. She appeared in the doorway with the slightly guilty expression of a child who has been told not to go to the kitchen and has gone to the kitchen anyway. 7 years old, dark hair, the wide-awake eyes of a child who missed nothing. She looked at Nell with frank assessment. Nell said, "You must be Miss Clara." The child said, "I am not supposed to be here. Nurse says the kitchen is not for children." Nell said, "Nurse is right generally, but you are here now. Would you like to see how pastry is made?" The child came in without further discussion and stood on a stool at the pastry table and watched with the focused concentration of someone learning something they intended to use. She asked good questions. She did not touch anything she had not been invited to touch. She tasted the pastry scraps when they were offered and gave her opinion without being asked for it, which was that they needed more butter. Nell said, "You may be right." The child stayed for an hour. She left when the bell rang for her tea upstairs, climbing down from the stool with reluctance and going back through the door with the expression of someone who intended to return. Nell watched her go. She thought about the page in the notebook. Bring it to her room yourself. Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face. She thought, I know her face now. She knows mine. When the thunderstorm comes, I will know whose door to knock on. December arrived. With it, the particular demands of a large Victorian household approaching Christmas, the increased orders from the village, the still room work beginning in earnest, the preserves and the mincemeat and the various things that needed to be made now for the table in 3 weeks, the kitchen running from before 5 until after 9, the staff stretched but managing, the range barely cooling between meals. Nell found she loved it. Not the exhaustion of it, her feet ached and her back told her about the hours, but the particular quality of a kitchen at full capacity, the way it became entirely itself in those weeks, everything the kitchen was and could do expressed at full volume, every person in it doing their work at the edge of their ability, the whole thing held together by the accumulated logic of the season and the skill of whoever was at the range. She was at the range. She held it together. With the particular capability of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and who had, this year, a notebook in the small drawer of the dresser that told her who needed what and when and how to provide it with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of effect. She used the notebook more in December than she had in November. Not as a recipe book, she had her own recipes, her own methods, her own knowledge accumulated over 20 years. As a guide to the people, as a reminder of what she had read and was now seeing the moments arriving the way the notebook had said they would. Mrs. Poole's increasing sharpness with the younger staff as the season pressed, and below it, if you looked, the tiredness, James quiet in the mornings after hard nights in the stable. Lily's particular fragility on the day's letters did not come. Mr. Carew managing everything above stairs with his professional composure perfectly intact and the cost of it invisible to everyone except the kitchen. She made the potted game for Mr. Carew in the 2nd week of December. She set it at his place at the servants' table without comment. He looked at it and looked at her. He said nothing immediately. Then he said simply, "This is very good." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Carew." He ate it with the careful appreciation of someone who had not expected to be thought of and was recalibrating slightly in response. She went back to the range. She thought about Martha Webb making this same dish at this same table. The same Mr. Carew, 31 years of him, sitting in that chair and being quietly fed the thing that said, without saying it, "I know what this costs you, and it is worth something to someone." She thought, this is what a kitchen can do. She thought, this is what she understood. On a Thursday in December, she found a note in the notebook that she had not noticed before. She had been reading a page near the middle, a recipe for Christmas pudding, the hall's own recipe, refined over many years. And tucked between this page and the next, a separate slip of paper, folded once. She unfolded it. The same small, neat hand, a different quality of writing, more deliberate, as though this had been written slowly and with care. To whoever reads this, I have been in this kitchen for 31 years. I am leaving it now because my hands will not do what I require of them, and a kitchen needs hands that work. This is right. I do not say it without difficulty, but I say it without bitterness, because this kitchen has been the best of my working life, and I am glad to have been in it. I have written what I know in this notebook, not the recipes. You will have your own. The people, because the people are the kitchen's real work, and the recipes are only the way the work is done. You will learn the rest yourself. There is always more to learn. That is what makes it worth doing. I hope you are well. I hope you are someone who understands what a kitchen is for. I think you must be, if you have read this far. The pudding recipe on the following page has too much nutmeg. I recommend reducing it by a quarter, but Mrs. Aldwick likes it as it is, so that is the version you should make. Nell read the note. She read it twice. Then she sat with it in the quiet kitchen, the afternoon lull, Lily polishing the coppers, Thomas on the hearthrug, the fire burning steady. She thought about Martha Webb leaving this kitchen, about 31 years of mornings at 5, and the range and the copper pots and the people and the small precise acts of seeing and providing, about hands that had finally given out, and the particular quiet courage of leaving something you had given your life to when the leaving was right. She thought about the note. I hope you are someone who understands what a kitchen is for. I think you must be, if you have read this far. She thought, I have read this far. She thought, I think I am beginning to understand. She folded the note carefully. She placed it back between the pages where she had found it. She closed the notebook. She returned it to the small drawer. She went back to the range. December pressing at the windows, the kitchen warm and entirely itself, the work continuing as it always did and always would. The people upstairs and in the stable yard and in the scullery and at the servants' table, each one carrying what they carried, each one needing what they needed. And in the kitchen, at the range, someone who was learning to speak their language, one meal at a time, one page at a time. January came to Aldwick Hall with cold. The real cold, not the preliminary cold of November or the considered cold of December, but the settled, committed cold of a Devon January that had decided what it was and had no interest in being otherwise. The kitchen windows frosted on the inside by morning. The yard outside the scullery door glittering at 6 o'clock when Nell went to check the state of the vegetable store. The range needing more coal than in any previous month. The fire in the hearth burning continuously now, rather than being banked for the night. The kitchen warm against all of it. This was the thing about a kitchen in January. The cold outside made the warmth inside more itself. The steam from the pots more visible. The smell of the fire more present. The amber light of the lamps against the frost on the windows more amber. The whole room more precisely what it was because winter had given it something to be warm against. Nell had been at Aldwick Hall for 2 months now. 2 months was still not long, but it was longer than not long. Long enough for the kitchen to feel like her kitchen rather than a kitchen she was tending. long enough for the staff to have found their arrangement with her Lily less careful, James more talkative, Mr. Carew occasionally pausing at the kitchen door in the evenings for a cup of tea he had never been invited for and was never refused. Long enough for Thomas to have decided she was worth sleeping near rather than merely near the range. Long enough for the notebook to have moved from being something she consulted to something she simply knew. She saw Mrs. Poole's hands in the second week of January. She had been looking without appearing to look for 2 months. And one morning, Mrs. Poole came to the kitchen for the daily conference and set her hands on the table, as she always did, and Nell saw it. The way the cold had got into the joints, the slight stiffness in the grip, the way she held her cup differently from November, more carefully, more deliberately, as though the ordinary act of holding a cup required a small additional decision. She said nothing. She went through the conference, the day's menus, the family's plans, the household requirements. She said good morning, and Mrs. Poole said good morning and left. Nell went to the larder. The onions were there, the good-keeping onions from the kitchen garden store, the barley in the dry goods cupboard, the stock from yesterday's roast chicken in the cold room she had made extra, as she always did now, knowing there was always something it would be needed for, the cream on the cold shelf. She began the soup in the late morning. Simple, as the notebook had said, onion softened slowly until it was sweet, barley added, and the stock poured over, left to do its work at the back of the range, where the heat was steady and unhurried. The kitchen smelling of it all afternoon, warm and substantial and undemanding. The smell of something that required nothing of the person who ate it, except that they sit down and be warm. At 4 o'clock, she ladled it into a small pot and brought it to Mrs. Poole's sitting room. She knocked and was admitted. She set the pot on the small table beside the chair where Mrs. Poole sat with her household accounts. She set a spoon and a cloth and a small plate of bread beside it. Mrs. Poole looked at the soup. She looked at Nell. Nell said, "The cold has been hard this week." Mrs. Poole said nothing for a moment. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been seen by someone they had not expected to see them, and who is deciding what to do with this. Then she said, "Martha used to bring me this soup." Nell said, "I know." Mrs. Poole looked at the pot. She said, "She taught you." Nell said, "In a way." Mrs. Poole looked at her hands on the account book. Then she looked at Nell with the expression that had been building since November, the expression that was not yet warmth, but was very close to it now. Very close. She said, "Thank you, Nell." It was the first time she had used her name. Nell said, "Good evening, Mrs. Poole." She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the range for a moment with her hands on the warm iron and felt something she could not quite name, something that was not pride and not satisfaction and not the feeling of having done a job well, though it was adjacent to all of those. Something more like the feeling of having understood something you had been trying to understand, of having spoken a language correctly for the first time and been heard. She thought, Martha Webb spoke this language for 31 years. She thought, I am beginning to learn it. On a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, she found the last page. She had read the notebook many times now, had thought she knew every page, but she had been reading quickly in recent weeks. December's pace had not entirely eased, the family still in residence, the kitchen still at full capacity. This Sunday, the house was quieter than usual. The family at church, the staff with their afternoon hour, just Nell and the kitchen and Thomas and the fire. She took the notebook from the drawer. She sat at the table. She opened it at the beginning and read slowly, letting each page have its full time. Mrs. Poole's soup, James's bread, Lily's lavender cake, Thomas the footman's custard, Mr. Carew's potted game, the small Clara and her warm milk and the face she needed to see. Each one read slowly, each one now connected in her mind to the moment it had described and the moment she had provided and the quiet, unremarkable thing that had happened as a result. She turned the pages, past the note she had found in December, past the Christmas pudding recipe with its too much nutmeg, past the last pages she had read before the winter preserves, the bread for the coldest weeks, the broth that was made only when someone was ill and needed something that asked nothing of them at all. She turned to what she had always thought was the last page, and found it was not. There was one more. A page she had somehow missed or skipped in all her readings, tucked between what she had thought was the last page and the back cover, pressed close, easy to overlook. She smoothed it open carefully. The same small, neat hand, but different from the rest, the writing slightly larger, slightly less even. Written, she thought, with different intention. For the new cook. Nell read the heading and was still. For the new cook. Not for Mrs. Poole. Not for James or Lily or Mr. Carew or small Clara. For her. For whoever had come after Martha Webb and found the notebook and read it and was now, in January, standing in this kitchen and learning its language and tending its people. She read on. You will have been here long enough now to have found your feet, long enough to know the range and the people and the particular way this kitchen moves through its year. Long enough, perhaps, to have used some of what I left you and to understand why I wrote it down. I do not know your name. I did not know who would come after me. But I know this kitchen and I know the kind of person it needs, and I believe because the kitchen is good at finding what it needs that you are that person. The recipe I am leaving you is not for anyone in the household. It is for you. Not the egg dish I wrote earlier that was for the afternoon. This is for the evening. For the end of a long day in January, when the cold is outside and the kitchen has been warm all day and the last thing has been done and the staff have gone to bed and it is just you and the fire and the cat and the particular quiet of a kitchen that has done its work. Make this then for yourself, no one else. Below the heading, a recipe. Simple, no more than 6 ingredients. All of them things any kitchen always had. A small amount of good butter, honey, cream warmed slowly, a very little brandy, the whole thing combined and poured into a cup and drunk warm at the kitchen table with nothing else required. And below the recipe, a final note. This kitchen will give you a great deal if you give it what it needs, which is attention, which is care, which is the willingness to notice the people in it and around it, and to speak to what they need in the language the kitchen speaks. You know this already, or you would not have read this far. I am not telling you anything you do not know. I am only telling you that I knew it too, and that this kitchen was the better for it, and so was I. Tend it well. It will tend you back. M.W. Nell sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the notebook open before her, the fire burning, Thomas on the hearthrug, one ear twitching in a dream, the copper pots on the wall, their warmth subdued in the afternoon light, the kitchen entirely itself, and entirely quiet, the particular Sunday quiet of a room that had been working hard all week and was resting. She read the page again. I believe because the kitchen is good at finding what it needs that you are that person. She thought about Martha Webb writing this, not knowing who would come, not knowing the name or the face or the history, writing for whoever it would be with the faith of someone who trusted the kitchen to do what kitchens did, which was to find the person it needed and keep them if they were right for it. She looked around the room, at the range she had come to know, at the dresser with its crockery and its small drawer, at the long table, pale and scrubbed, at the herbs drying from the beam, at the window with its frost still on the glass, in the shaded corner where the January sun had not yet reached. She thought, I am that person. She thought it quietly, without drama, simply as a fact that had been true for some time and was now being acknowledged. She was the person this kitchen needed, not because she was exceptional, because she was attentive, because she had found the notebook and read it and understood what it was saying and had done what it asked, because she had come to Devon to be somewhere that was not London and had found, in the process, something she had not known she was looking for. A kitchen that spoke, and people who needed to be heard. That evening she made the recipe. After the last thing was done, after Lily had gone to bed and Mr. Carew had said his good night and the family's dinner things had been cleared and the kitchen was as settled as it got at the end of a day, Thomas awake now and watching her from the hearthrug with the focused interest of a cat who knows when food is being prepared and is making his position known. She found the butter, the good butter from the dairy, the honey from the jar on the third shelf, the cream, still good, the brandy from the still room cupboard. She assembled them on the table with the particular care she gave to everything in this kitchen, now not ceremony, simply the care of someone who understood that everything in the preparation was part of the thing being made. She warmed the cream slowly at the back of the range, added the honey, added the butter and let it melt, added the brandy last, just enough, the recipe had said, which she understood to mean just enough and not more, poured it into a cup. She sat at the table. She sat and drank it slowly in the quiet evening kitchen with the fire and the lamp and Thomas now beside her feet, having decided that proximity to the cup was worth the indignity of the floor. The kitchen around her, its smell wood smoke and the residual warmth of a day's cooking and the faint sweetness of the cream and honey and the deeper note of the brandy, the copper pots on the wall, the frost on the window, the house above very still, the Devon night outside very dark. She thought about Martha Webb sitting at this table, 31 years of evenings in this chair, this kitchen, this quiet, making this same cup, perhaps, on the evenings when the long day needed something at the end of it, being tended by the kitchen she tended. She thought, I understand now. Not everything there was much she did not yet know and would not know for years, but the essential thing, what the kitchen was for, what the notebook was for, what, all of it, the 31 years and the pages and the particular attention to particular people and the small precise acts of seeing and providing had been for. It was for this, for the kitchen being warm and the people in it being known, and the knowing expressed in the only language that needed no courage to speak, the language of a cup of soup set at someone's place, of bread sent to the stables without a message, of a cake left on a table for someone who had been crying and would not say why. The language of I see you, of it will be all right, of you are allowed to sit down, the kitchen will wait. She finished the cup. She rinsed it at the sink. She banked the fire for the night. She did the small things. At the dresser, she stopped. She opened the small drawer. She took out the notebook. She stood at the dresser and held it for a moment, the faded green cloth, the soft page edges, the warmth of a kitchen that had been in it for 31 years, and was still there. Then she opened it to the page after the last page, the blank page, the page after Martha Webb's last entry, white and waiting. She went to the table. She found a pen and the inkwell she kept for the household accounts. She sat down. She thought for a moment. Then she began to write. Small and neat not her usual hand, which was practical and quick, something more deliberate, the hand of someone writing something that would last. For Thomas, the footman, when a letter from home has not come in 3 weeks, and he is very quiet at dinner. She wrote the recipe below it, not the custard, her own recipe, a different thing, something she had made as a child in her own mother's kitchen, something that came from her own knowledge of what it felt like to be far from home and need the particular comfort of something familiar. She finished the entry. She looked at what she had written, her handwriting in the notebook beside Martha Webb's. 2 different hands, 2 different lives, 2 different sets of years in this kitchen. The same intention, the same language, the same understanding of what the kitchen was for and what it could do for the people it served. She turned the page. Another blank page, waiting, as the notebook had always been waiting, not finished, continued, by whoever came to this kitchen and found the small drawer and read what was there and understood it and added their own knowledge to it. Year after year, kitchen after kitchen, the language passed on, the people seen, the kitchen warm. She put the notebook back in the small drawer. She turned off the lamp. The kitchen in firelight, now only the banked fire low and amber, the copper pots catching the last of it, Thomas a dark shape on the hearthrug, entirely still. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the room, at the range and the table and the dresser and the small drawer, at the copper pots, at the frost on the high window and the January dark beyond, at Thomas profoundly asleep, one paw over his nose as always, as if he had never been otherwise. She thought, "Good night, kitchen." She thought this and found it entirely natural. The way you said good night to something that deserved it, that had earned it. That would be here in the morning when she came down at 5 and built the fire up and put the kettle on and began again. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, its sounds, the wind, the old stone, the deep Devon quiet pressing in from all sides. She thought about the blank pages, about what she would write on them. Not all at once, these things could not be written all at once. They had to be earned, had to come from the watching and the noticing and the accumulation of years spent in the same kitchen with the same people, learning what they needed and when and in what form, the way Martha Webb had earned them. 31 years of earning. She had 2 months. She had the rest. Outside, the Devon night was deep and cold and entirely still, the hall above sleeping, the kitchen below warm, the small drawer in the dresser, the notebook inside it, her handwriting on a new page beside Martha Webb's, the kitchen tending its cook, as it had always done, as it would, for whoever came and gave it what it needed, which was attention, which was care, which was the willingness to stay.